So, in the wake of increasing anti immigration sentiments and isolationist tendencies in various countries and also in the geopolitics, do you think the dynamics of globalization would change, and would these factors accelerate the process of deglobalization? And also, sir, how do you think the rise of anti immigration sentiments and the rapid development of technology in the world would play out for globalization?
Actually, these two are opposing forces. On the one hand, technology, which is transnational, nation states or societies have no power or control over it. On the other hand, the borders are national, therefore, your sovereignty applies there. So, two opposing forces are now at work. How will we create a framework in which the people's migration will be facilitated depending on the economic need and demographic balance rather than their prejudices? I wish I could give you an answer in the affirmative that in the next 10 years it will happen. My suspicion is it will happen in the next 100 years. Meanwhile, there will be a lot of confusion. Germany, for instance, embraced about 800,000 immigrants from Syria, etc., because of economic logic, because Germany requires young people. It's a manufacturing behemoth. Until China took over, became the number one manufacturer. Germany was the number one manufacturer earlier, you must remember. About a decade ago, Germany was number one manufacturer in the world, number one exporter in the world. So for a small country of 80 million people, it's a huge manufacturing machine. So they require a large number of manufacturing workers, and they have a superb institutional mechanism in place to train young people and skill them to be manufacturing workers. So Angela Merkel took a deliberate decision, apart from humanitarian considerations, an economic decision for Germany's prosperity. But she paid a humongous price. A person who was an unchallenged leader of the country, while she still respected, she certainly lost a tremendous amount of political capital. It's a very hard decision. Elsewhere in the world, even that much has not been done because they could not absorb immigrants even when they needed them. There's no mechanism in place to really utilize them in a productive way. Apart from all the insecurities and prejudices and religion, race, and so on and so forth. So we have a very complex situation. Will this get better? Not in the short term. But if we take a long-term trajectory, if some conditions are fulfilled, I would actually say when some conditions are fulfilled, because I believe it's more when than if. If much of the world comes to some kind of a stabilization of population, right now, Europe and America, there's a decline in population. America, immigrants and birth rates are okay, they're at least maintaining. But almost all of Europe, China, many other, Japan, East Asia, there's a decline in population. India is now at a stabilization level. Population will increase for some more time. Our fertility rates are already below 2 nationally. It's only going to get even less. And therefore, after some time, actually, once we reach a peak of, say, 1.6 billion population, chances are we'll have plateau and then declining population. Africa is going to increase up to 2.5 billion. It's now at 1 billion plus. It will actually rise by 2.5 times. But after that, it will also plateau and slowly decrease, because even in Africa, the fertility rates are falling, except that they are about 30, 40 years behind us. So once the stabilization is there and there's some kind of an understanding of where the demography is headed, some of the insecurities will diminish. Simultaneously, the countries which are losing population, they realize the desperate need for economic management of sensible migration. And two, if there is no desperation in migration, like yesterday, today, there's a lot of talk about a lot of people breaching the Mexico or America border and more or less invading America. Now, there is no way any country will be able to allow that. Otherwise, what is the nation state system about? What are borders about? What are laws of immigration about? So whatever we say from outside, it simply is not feasible. Because America opens its borders, all of us from India and much of Asia and Africa will move to America overnight. It simply is not a sustainable proposition, however much many people wish it. But if when rather than if, world reaches a level of reasonable, not prosperity, but reasonable level of comfort, so that there's no desperation to move out of your geography for survival, then it will be much easier to manage migration. I think that's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years across the world. Already, many parts of the world are much more prosperous than they were earlier. Abject poverty, thanks to China and to some extent India, their governmental efforts is decreasing considerably. Much of the rest of the world will follow suit in the next 30, 40 years. So once these conditions are fulfilled, I think there will be greater balance and less of prejudice and hatred. And immigration will be much more sensible. It will never be perfect in the next 50, 100 years. 100 years later, maybe a transnational government is possible, a pan-global government. And maybe then more or less free borders may be available. But it will take a long time. It's not going to happen in the next few years. I don't see it happening.
So, also, given implications of artificial intelligence to disrupt labor markets, do you think it would harbor the anti immigration sentiments influencing the world migration trends, ultimately also impacting the trajectory of globalization?
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, the economic insecurities arising out of technological advances and change of the global manufacturing hubs. These two things are certainly going to impact domestic politics, attitudes to migration, attitudes to people of other nations or nationalities, inevitably. And nobody really knows what's going to happen. There are some people who argue that 70% of the jobs that your generation is going to hold 20, 30 years later, they have not yet been created. So, in a fundamental sense, once we address the great challenge of poverty and deprivation in many poor countries, the global challenge for humanity is how are we going to employ everybody productively? It's not only an economic necessity, it's also a psychological necessity. Without productive employment, human beings become hollow, invisible, irrelevant, lacking in self esteem, with all kinds of psychological and societal challenges. So, how are we going to create employment to the bulk of the people when technology is inexorably moving in a direction where fewer and fewer people are producing more and more? This is a unique feature of our age. It was earlier, some glimpses were seen, that's how Luddites came. The moment manufacturing came, the Luddites feared that the traditional arts and crafts, they will lose employment, and therefore they went about breaking machines. But the small change compared to the kind of change that we are now witnessing or going to witness in the next few decades. The world is undergoing a kind of transformation that was never before witnessed with such breathtaking rapidity. And therefore, the whole economic management globally or within nation states, I don't know if I can even imagine. I can only sort of, have some conjectures, but nobody really knows. And it's a challenge that modern world has to deal with that. But the good news is overall prosperity is increasing. Overall, our sense of freedom is increasing. Our capacity to negotiate the complex world as individuals is increasing. But there is a fundamental global challenge 50 years hence of how are you going to employ the bulk of humanity productively, not only for their economic security, but for their psychological and social security. I think that's yet to be written.